Thanks for joining us on another busy night of all things people, power, and politics on Detroit's only nightly political talk show. This is The Pulse. I'm Rupraj. We're glad you're making us your home for unbiased political news each and every night. You know, a lot of controversial and complicated issues, so toss that phone aside. You don't have to ask what's real, what's not. We'll help sort through all of it right now. Another sign today that National Guard troops are headed into Chicago. We're taking you to a contentious Senate hearing involving Attorney General Pam Bondi, and we're hearing from former U.S. Attorney Matthew Schneider about this deployment debate. And now that the state budget is officially signed, we're hearing from a Metro Detroit School Board trustee about the impact it will have for our kids. Free school lunches stay, per pupil funding increased. We're diving into all of it and what's still missing. But we begin with a somber anniversary overseas. 2 years since Hamas stormed southern Israel, including army bases, farming communities, and that music festival that so many in the world had been talking about. The terror attack plunging the entire region into war. The surprise attack by Hamas killed close to 1,200 people, most of those civilians. According to the Associated Press, 251 people were kidnapped. Now, most have been released. 48, though, remain, and Israel believes about 20 are still alive. Hamas says they will release them, but only if there's a lasting ceasefire and if Israel actually withdraws from Gaza. Now, Israel retaliated, as you know, with a punishing offensive against Gaza. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, those attacks have killed 67,000 Palestinians and injured nearly 170,000. Those numbers are hard to swallow, and they mean 11% of Gaza's entire population has been killed or hurt. And as we dive even deeper, we know more than 18,000 Palestinian kids, more than 9,000 Palestinian women, and more than 4,000 Palestinian elderly people have died since Israel launched that offensive. The years-long siege has also caused starvation, with at least 30% of people in Gaza reportedly going days without having anything to eat. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's response has been condemned on the world stage, with the world's top war crimes court issuing arrest warrants for him, his defense minister, and military chief last year. They accused him of these war crimes, including using starvation as a method of warfare. Netanyahu has said Israel won't stop fighting until Hamas is defeated. Right now, we know there are peace talks going on between Israel and Hamas. Part of President Trump's plan calls for Gaza to be under international governance and Hamas to be disarmed. He and former British Prime Minister Tony Blair would oversee this. Hamas has not agreed to those parts of the plan. Well, coming up in less than 20 minutes, we're actually talking with the leader of interfaith group Michigan Roundtable for Just Communities. How can we all come together and talk about a topic that hits so close to home for so many who are watching on the other side of that camera or that phone? Right now, we do want to run through some of the other big stories that we're following right now. Day 7 of the government shutdown, and still no closer to a deal. Democrats want to strike a deal with Republicans to extend Affordable Care Act subsidies, but Republicans say they won't talk about it or any other policy while the government is still shut down. All of this while federal workers are going unpaid, and the White House suggests President Trump could block back pay once the government reopens. We should point out he signed a law in 2019 to make sure federal workers got back pay during a shutdown. But the White House Budget Office now claims back pay must be provided by Congress as part of any bill to fund the government. Well, the government shutdown not stopping lawmakers from doing other business, and part of that was a heated hearing between Attorney General Pam Bondi and the Senate Judiciary Committee today. Bondi refused to answer as Democrats pressed her on politically charged investigations, firings of career prosecutors, and other matters. Republicans defended her, saying the criminal cases against President Trump show the DOJ was politicized already. But there was also this exchange between Bondi and Illinois Democrat Dick Durbin about the National Guard moving into American cities.
Were you consulted by the White House before they deployed National Guard troops to cities in the United States?
I am not going to discuss any internal conversations with the White House.
You won't even say whether you talked to the White House about this?
I am not going to discuss any internal conversations with the White House with you, Ranking Member.
I noticed that. What's the secret? Why do you want to keep this secret? The American people don't know the rationale behind the deployment of National Guard troops in my state. The word is, and I think it's been confirmed by the White House, they are going to transfer Texas National Guard units to the state of Illinois. What's the rationale for that?
Yeah, Chairman, as you shut down the government, you voted to shut down the government, and you're sitting here, our law enforcement officers aren't being paid. They're out there working to protect you. I wish you loved Chicago as much as you hate President Trump. And currently, the National Guard are on the way to Chicago. If you're not going to protect your citizens, President Trump will.
Now, at this hour, we know National Guard members from Texas are at an Army Reserve Center in Illinois, like you heard Pam Bondi say there. That's the most visible sign of the Trump administration's plan to send troops to Chicago. Here to dive deeper into this, former U.S. Attorney Matthew Schneider, and it's always good to see you. Thanks for joining us here tonight on The Pulse.
Thank you, Roop. Nice to be back.
So a little bit, we got to pull the curtain back. And before we get into some of the other points, just your thoughts on the political calculus. When someone is sitting in the hot seat like that, they're essentially saying, look, I don't have to tell you about classified talks that I've had inside the White House. But I think Dick Durbin, the lawmaker, was simply asking, what is the rationale behind wanting to send the troops? So far on the record, what do we know is the Trump administration's rationale behind this?
So their rationale is that it's a war zone and there's crime that's violent and it's exceeding and it keeps going up. And the government from the Trump administration is saying that's our rationale and we don't have to have a lot of further explanations. But the president is essentially saying, I'm the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. I'm overseeing that aspect of this, and I have a duty to protect the citizens in the several states. And Illinois is one of the several states, and therefore my rationale from the president's viewpoint, that's what he's saying, is that he has an obligation to do this. Now, we heard Pam Bondi not answer the question. That's certainly not the first time we've heard a cabinet secretary not answer a question, but it did get quite contentious there, and I expect that'll also continue.
Yeah, a little bit of political theater happening from some of the lawmakers as well as midterms come up, of course. Who's fighting for who? They want everyone back home to hear it. Let's just face it, that's part of it. But there is also the question. And I do want to point out what I found something that was striking. Megyn Kelly, who's been, as you know, a huge defender of President Trump, said constitutionally, I can't support President Trump going over J.B. Pritzker's head and sending National Guard troops in because the Constitution comes first. From an objective point of view, is that true, that the Constitution prohibits under any circumstance the president overruling a governor in this case?
So the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. That's absolutely true that the Constitution does prevail. But we have Title 10, for example, and that's what the president's drawing upon. He's drawn upon Title 32 as well. These are federal laws that provide for the mechanism to take troops and put them into the states. So that's currently being litigated, and we've had some rulings some ways. We'll likely have some appeals. We'll have rulings other ways. I mean, if it wasn't a debatable point, we wouldn't have judges who issued opinions and dissents. So there is some legal authority here. Probably what we have to do is get that up to the Court of Appeals and perhaps to the Supreme Court, and then we can really firmly have a decision on what the law of the land is.
You know, it's such an old act, the Insurrection Act. When you read it, it sounds like you're reading something out of history, and it truly does live in our history books, but it's being brought to life right now. One of the points in the Insurrection Act, as I read it, was, hey, there has to be a rebellion in order for the president to use the Insurrection Act. At what point can he basically say that extreme crime is a rebellion against peace? Is that something that he could try to argue?
So the Insurrection Act actually provides for a lot more. It says rebellion, yes, but it's more than that. It's in the president's determination. When the president determines there's an unlawful assembly or an obstacle in the state that is obstructing federal law. If that is the case, the president has to, first of all, issue a proclamation demanding that the people go home and stop obstructing federal law. And number two, then the president has to effectuate and say that the normal judicial process isn't working. That's what the Insurrection Act requires. We are not there yet because currently the judicial process is being played out. It's being played out using these other statutes. And that's why we haven't seen the president use the Insurrection Act yet, because these other cases are still in the pipeline. It's only once those resolve, or perhaps when they don't turn out the way President Trump wants them to through the appeal system, only then is he going to be able to exhaust his local remedies and use the Insurrection Act.
Does he go into a state like Louisiana where it seems like the law enforcement and some of the locals there are more amenable to this, and try his hand there in order to set some kind of precedence?
So that's exactly what he's doing. You can see that he's using Texas National Guard troops to bring them to Illinois. That actually sets up a completely different legal obstacle. It's the 10th Amendment. These states are sovereign, and Illinois is saying, we are a sovereign state. You can't use troops from some other state to put them into my state. That violates the 10th Amendment, which is part of the Constitution. That's actually an issue that has very lightly been litigated, and that's an appeal point that very much could go to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they could decide one way or the other whether or not President Trump's right or wrong about that.
The president obviously is well aware of the circumstances we're talking about here on this broadcast, and because of that is moving slowly, of course, kind of assembling people nearby, but not necessarily kind of, going through with it right now. We'll have to watch this one really closely, and we know you'll be along for the ride every step of the way. Matthew Schneider, former U.S. attorney, good to see you. Thanks for joining us here on The Pulse tonight.
Thank you, Roop.
We're turning now to the state budget. So much to talk about after the break. The battle is over. Now school leaders are talking about the impact, and there's some good news here for your kids, your grandkids, your nieces, your nephews. Waterford School Board trustee John Paul Torres is in Studio C. You're watching The Pulse on Fox 2. Back now on The Pulse, looking at all things people, power, and politics. Here to talk about the school budget passing and the impact it will have, Waterford School Board trustee John Paul Torres. And it's good to see you, as always, here on The Pulse.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We don't often talk about school budgets on this show, but this is important because it impacts so many parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, our whole community, our future. And we should be talking about it. But specifically, usually we don't bring up good news, because usually when government works, then that's supposed to happen. You don't say that's news, but in this case, it is news that it worked well. Talk about the winners of this school budget as a trustee.
I think there's a lot of winners. School districts, at least in our school district, we were pleasantly surprised. We're seeing about a $442 increase in per pupil funding. So that's the amount of money that goes to each student that we get from the state for each student. It's going from about $9,600 to a little over $10,000. And then we're seeing categorical increases. So that's increases for at-risk youth, for funding for social emotional programs, school safety, about a 25% increase in that, and then investing in the young children, the pre-K programs, so the Great Start Readiness programs, we're seeing the continuation of that, and then the thing everybody's is very popular about is the free meal programs. Breakfast and lunch is going to continue. I
want to ask you about that because it's interesting when you have people sounding off. And I attribute social media, and I'm sorry for slamming it all the time, but it's really, sometimes it's just a terrible place. Could you imagine if there was an actual place that was social media? You walked in, you go, this is the world. But people say things like, kids don't need these free meals. Not all kids should be getting them. When you hear people saying that, and I'm sure you've seen the comments, what's your reaction to that?
I think that as a school district and as school leaders, we have to treat the whole child. Children do unfortunately come to school hungry. And some of them aren't just students who are low income. Some kids, if you're a parent, you know how hard it is to get your kid to eat breakfast in the morning. So we call it second chance breakfast that they get. So they come to school, they get food in their belly. We know they need to have that food in their belly in order to succeed academically. And then you look at the lunch programs. If a kid who is less fortunate is getting a free lunch, he's not being separated from other students. And on top of that, the parents that are sending their kids, they don't have to make lunch a lot of times. Me as a parent of the sixth grader, a lot of days I don't have to make lunch, and that saves me time in the morning. The estimated cost to save parents actually is about $1,000 a year if they don't have to make lunch, and it gets their kids to try different things and have a nutritious meal.
And so many people, whether you can actually afford to pack a kid's lunch or not, things are tighter, everything's more expensive. I mean, call it what you want, but President Biden and President Trump claim that the economy is one way, but people are suffering in a different way. Both presidents have promised, hey, there's no such thing as inflation. Things aren't more expensive. They are. I do want to ask you, I found that point very interesting, that the kids who would get the free meals would feel like they were separated from the other kids. Talk about what that looks like in a lunchroom.
Well, I think it has a psychological aspect to it that we all remember from when we were kids. We all kind of knew the kids that were free and reduced lunch. And, they were separated, they were on a list. So we don't see that anymore
That's
with
great.
these universal programs. And so it serves that purpose, and then it serves the purpose of being able to feed all, because it's a win-win for everybody.
When you say that the school aid budget went up more than $400, roughly $9,600 to more than $10,000,
yeah.
break down what that means when it comes to the classroom. Like, what kinds of things are we talking about?
So that's looking at curriculum, that's looking at teachers. So we see that all the time, where we see teachers who have too many kids in the classroom, right? That's going to allow us to hire more teachers. But then we got to look at those categoricals, because it all plays in. The categoricals are going to help us with the at-risk students. The funding for social emotional needs, the children who may be having social emotional problems, so it's more school counselors, all those kinds of things. So there's a lot of differences, but that school aid fund is coveted, those dollars, that $10,000 roughly, because we can only use that for the classroom. We can't use it for anything else. Or we can use it for the classroom,
Sure.
but we can use it for other things as well. The categoricals, to the reverse, we can't use those for other things. So for us, I think that putting that money in the classroom is key and important.
Can Lansing teach Washington a thing or two about bipartisanship based on this budget passing here at home?
I really think they can. I mean, I saw the bipartisanship of the legislature come together, the governor, everybody came together, and it was a win-win for families, for kids, for public education. And I'd love to see the federal level. I'd like to see Washington do that.
Yeah, Republicans and Democrats both agree that kids and the future of our kids is very, very important. That's something that I know you're very excited about as well. It's so good to see you, John Paul Torres, Waterford School Board trustee. Always great to have you on the Pulse.
you.
Come back again and talk to us.
Appreciate it.
The real effects of policy hitting right here at the classroom at home. Good stuff. We're turning now, though, back to the somber anniversary of the Hamas attacking Israel after the break. How all sides can come together and stop the violence and the rhetoric. You're watching The Pulse on Fox 2. Thanks for staying with us on The Pulse, here to talk about the anniversary of the October 7th attacks and how all of us can try to come together and live this life in somewhat of peace. Yusef Shakur, he's the executive director of the Michigan Roundtable for Just Communities, a wonderful organization that looks at ways to bring people together and not split us apart. It is the opposite of how this world seems to be going in so many ways. And Yusef, it's so good to see you. Thanks for joining us on The Pulse tonight.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You're the new head of this wonderful organization. As you reflect on this day, how do you frame it in your mind when you think about all of the Arab Americans out there in Metro Detroit, all the Jewish Americans in Metro Detroit?
The way I frame it is, we have to understand that the tragic of that day, it speaks to a long history, a long struggle, where one group has been occupied, another group living in fear. Equally, where both children are not having the opportunity to grow up and live, and their lives are being taken from them. And that is a tragedy that should speak to all of us. And the call to action that justice is necessary, and that is the mission of the Roundtable. But it requires us to have a willingness to sit down and talk and see beyond our own discomfort and understanding the history of that plight and being able to put forth the greater good.
And Yusef, the history is uncomfortable because obviously there's a lot of tragedy in this terrible story. It didn't begin on October 7th.
Correct.
When we look at more than one truth existing at the same time, it is true that October 7th was an abhorrent, vile, terrible attack on human beings. It's also true that 67 or 70,000, close to 70,000 people being killed, some of them innocent people, is also vile and abhorrent and awful. How do you teach people to hold two truths in the same hands?
We teach through the ability to recognize that it's not an either or, it's a both and. But how our minds are operating, how we've been taught in the society, it has to be an either or. And I've learned through my own personal journey and my own personal experience that trying to be right is not always the right thing to do. Being principled is different. Being the ability to value others, the ability to listen. We don't find joy in agreement. We find joy, which is the opposite of discomfort. the opposite of you get harmony through disharmony, right? The ability to have, again, those tough conversations. We live in a country that has a very brutal history, but the ability to talk about that, right? Where, folks who are enslaved, folks who have been, their land has been taken from them. And having that tough conversation about those things helps shape the reality of moving us forward.
How do you have a tough conversation when things are so heated, when people feel so strongly about their motherlands, respectively?
Mm-hmm. I've had opportunity to travel abroad, and so when you can see things and from an up close position, but also I think is the ability to look at history for what it is, for not what we want it to be. And that is where we find liberation of ourselves, liberating us from these false dichotomies. Because when we get out of these false dichotomies, we get away from this hegemonic position, feeling the need to control and dominate, because that does nothing but perpetuate oppression.
And I imagine that part of that is actually deep acknowledgement. Mm-hmm. In other words, if someone says what happened on October 7th was terrible and was just awful, and these hostages must be released, there's someone out there can say, yes, I acknowledge that. But at the same time, we can acknowledge that the strike against Gazans has been terrible and hard.
Right.
We can recognize and deeply acknowledge that. Does acknowledging help us move forward into that uncomfortable yet important conversation?
Acknowledging is one thing, but also there's a level of act, a level of doing. And I think from there, there's no crime in compromising. The crime is the ability to not willing to listen, not willing to engage. So being governed by a set of values, a set of principles, and understanding that how people are hurt. Again, even where we are today, confronting our present reality of where we have the militarization of ICE on the streets that's deploying. Like you told me this 10 years ago, this would be the America today. We probably would have argued over there, right? If you told me that there will be a bill that's coming about that's taking people opportunity to have Medicaid, right? This is a tragic situation right here. But there's folks on one side who are saying that's necessary. But if that's absolutely necessary, then the next question, do we live in a just society? And everyone would say yes, probably, but in reality, what about those who don't live in just society? That is the gap that we have to fill.
Where can people find Michigan Roundtable if they want to get involved and take part in some of the great meetings that you all have?
They go to our website at michiganroundtable.org.
Wonderful. MichiganRoundtable.org.
Yeah.
Yusef, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us here on The Pulse.
Thank you for having me.
We appreciate your time, and we wish everybody peace as they try to process this day. That is The Pulse for tonight. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Rup Raj. As always, it was good to be with you.
Thank you.